found that crimes against humanity target anyone considered to pose a threat to the political system and leadership of North Korea. Possibly one of the Commission's most troubling findings, and this is all pervasive throughout the report of the Commission, is that these egregious human rights violations and the crimes against humanity committed in North Korea are not an unfortunate side effect of the operation of the Kim regime. They are at the very core of the modus operandi of the Kim regime in North Korea. So who are the victims? The primary targets of the regime are the estimated 120,000 inmates of North Korea's political prison camp system, inmates of other prisons and detention facilities, persons who try to escape from North Korea, in particular those forcibly repatriated from China, Christians and other religious believers, and other people considered to introduce subversive influences. Some of the influences mentioned by Hyun-soo in her presentation, for example, bringing in video material from South Korea or about the outside world. The Commission has also found that crimes against humanity have been committed against a number of persons that I mentioned earlier from the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Japan, and other countries who were abducted or denied repatriation. Who is accountable for these crimes against humanity? The Commission has found that the main perpetrators of human rights violations and crimes against humanity are officials of North Korea's internal political police, the State Security Department, North Korea's quasi-police force that also exercises political police functions, the Ministry of People's Security, the Korean People's Army, the Office of the Public Prosecutor, the Judiciary, and the Workers' Party of Korea. On January the 20th of last year, the Commission sent a letter to the Supreme Leader of North Korea, to Kim Jong-un himself, drawing his attention to the principle of command and superior responsibility under international criminal law. According to the command responsibility principle, Kim Jong-un himself incurs personal criminal responsibility if he knows that officials under his effective control have committed and are committing crimes against humanity. Has North Korea cooperated with the Commission? The answer is simple. No, North Korea has continued to refuse to cooperate with the Commission, as it had refused previously to cooperate with the UN Special Rapporteur on the North Korean human rights situation. What is going to happen next? There is a Human Rights Council resolution that has been tabled basically early this month. The Human Rights Council had already decided that it would transmit the Commission's report to the UN Secretary General and to other relevant bodies of the United Nations for appropriate action. In this regard, the Commission has formulated a number of recommendations directly addressed to the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretary General, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. What recommendations has the Commission made? What recommendations has, first and foremost, the Commission made to the government of North Korea? The Commission has found that North Korea requires profound institutional reforms, starting at the very top and center of the nation's institutions. The detailed recommendations of the Commission cover a number of specific matters, including the release of political prisoners, the acknowledgement and dismantlement of the political prison camps, and also justice, penitentiary, and security sector reform, a moratorium on and abolition of the death penalty, independent media and access to information, human rights education and abolition of war propaganda and national hatred, freedom for Christians and other religious believers, abolition of discrimination on the basis of state-assigned social class and related surveillance, gender equality, access to the right to food, including through non-discriminatory policies, adjustment of public expenditure patterns, and unimpeded international humanitarian access, lifting of the foreign and internal travel restrictions on ordinary citizens, clarification of the fate of victims of international enforced disappearances and their repatriation, reunification of separated families, and the prosecution of perpetrators of crimes against humanity as part of a comprehensive transitional justice process. One very important recommendation that the Commission has made to the international community is that the case be referred by the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court at the meeting of the UN Human Rights Council after the submission of the report by the COI on March the 17th. The European Union, together with Japan, Australia, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, clearly stated their support for Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court. Another important recommendation that the Commission made was that the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights establish a field-based presence in the region to document human rights violations in North Korea, in particular in cases where they amount to crimes against humanity. As far as I know, discussions are ongoing. The location of that office might be Seoul, it might be Bangkok. Probably Seoul will make perfect sense for a variety of reasons. The Commission has also addressed the very important issue of economic sanctions against North Korea. And Hyun-soo has mentioned a very important issue. The sanctions regime, the international sanctions regime based on UN Security Council resolutions aiming to deal with the very important issue of counterproliferation of North Korean nuclear and missile technology is related only to that. It is not related to human rights concerns. Certainly the Commission of Inquiry has made it clear that it does not support sanctions that amount to an attack on the North Korean economy or the people of North Korea. It is in favor of targeted sanctions. Here in the United States, certainly, we are aware of H.R. 1771, the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act, a piece of legislation that, as far as I know, has been recently reviewed, and a piece of legislation that could address some of the concerns raised by the Commission of Inquiry. There are certainly provisions that targeted sanctions against North Korean officials who have committed crimes against humanity or egregious human rights violations would be targeted against those individuals only. And actually there are provisions in the revised version of H.R. 1771 that would allow for money that would have been otherwise spent on nuke technology, missile technology, or luxury goods to be spent by the North Korean authorities on food for the people of North Korea. What recommendations has the Commission had for China? Certainly the Commission has called China by name, pointing out that the People's Republic of China has continued to forcibly repatriate North Korean refugees to condition of danger, claiming against what is stated in the 1951 UN Convention for the Protection of Refugees, that these North Korean refugees are illegal economic migrants. They're not illegal economic migrants. They face conditions of danger, as Hyun-soo mentioned in her presentation, if returned to North Korea. What is certainly very interesting is that on Monday last week, China, together with Cuba, Belarus, Iran, Syria, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Laos, and Myanmar, spoke against the use of country-specific mechanisms and mandates such as UN commissions of inquiry. China certainly continued to claim that the North Korean refugees who it forcibly returns are illegal economic migrants and not political refugees. But not one of these countries, not one, not even China, spoke in defense of the human rights record of the Kim regime. Thank you very much.
Listening to this litany of horrors and all the recommendations, I've been asked to talk about, well, where do we go from here? What's next? Let me first repeat three of the points that Greg has made. One is that this is the very first time that a UN body has recognized that crimes against humanity are taking place in North Korea. It's the very first time that a UN body has called for accountability organizations, civil society, foundations, business enterprises, experts, concerned institutions. These are all mentioned in the report. So what we hear is a very broad-based international effort is needed to try to bring change to the DPRK. Let's first look at the United Nations, where the action is right now. To begin with, the report is a game changer. For the past few years, resolutions at the UN on North Korean human rights have been adopted by consensus, that is, without a vote. However, and this, may I add, this was a development that had evolved over time with more and more willingness on the part of the international community to acknowledge that human rights violations were very severe in North Korea. But now, with these findings and with China publicly opposing, it looks like there will have to be a vote. So the United States and the European Union, Japan, and the Republic of Korea are going to have to go out and bring in votes to endorse the findings. And that is what's happening right now at the Human Rights Council, which has 47 member states. And the resolution on this issue has been tabled. It acknowledges crimes against humanity by North Korea. It calls for Security Council action to deal with accountability and targeted sanctions. And a majority vote is expected. But how strong a majority will that be? And that's not yet known. I just want to mention one particular country at the Council that is an interesting case. It's a small African country in southern Africa called Botswana. And they're on the Human Rights Council, and they have terminated relations with North Korea over this report. And presumably, they're not only speaking out, they are speaking out, but presumably they're also trying to mobilize others to join with them in supporting the resolution. Thereafter, action will go to the General Assembly in the fall. And there will be 193 states. And again, the goal will be to have a resolution at the Assembly to again strongly mention crimes against humanity, and also to call for bringing the report of the Commission to the Security Council to deal with accountability and targeted sanctions. Now, many debates are taking place right now about what will happen if it goes to the Security Council. Will the Security Council refer the case to the International Criminal Court or a special tribunal? This is unlikely because China has a veto and will no doubt use it. Some advocate that the West pushed a vote in the Council so that China is shown up vetoing and defending a government whose human rights record is considered unparalleled in the contemporary world. Others suggest another route, and that is placing the North Korean human rights situation on the agenda of the Security Council, and that 9 out of 15 votes are needed to do that. There's no veto for a procedural matter like that. And there can be then discussions at the Security Council, briefings at the Security Council, possibly a presidential statement, and it can lay the groundwork for later action. To do this, though, is not the easiest thing, although it may sound that way. But priority will have to be given by Western governments to get that accomplished. Priority where it would not just be the nuclear issue, which is before the Security Council, but the human rights issue and the connection between the nature of the regime and international peace and security. Another possibility for the Security Council, but this is not exclusive, mutually exclusive of having it on the agenda, is informal meetings of members of the Security Council with the Commission of Inquiry, and to have discussions about the Commission of Inquiry report, and to have other speakers. And this is called the ARIA process, and in mid-April this will be pursued, this will occur. Now finally, there's talk about whether the General Assembly can be the body. Given that the Security Council may not do that, the General Assembly may be the body to establish a tribunal for North Korea. This is something that is discussed. So there's a lot at play at the UN right now. As for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, the Human Rights Office, Greg mentioned that there's an effort being made to set up a special field-based office, and this office would carry the same intense monitoring and documentation of the human rights situation in North Korea. It's very important because the office would be set up looking to eventual accountability, that is, trials. Funds will be needed to do that, and I hope that Western governments, including the United States government, will support this effort. The visibility needs to be kept up, and the documentation is very important. Now, beyond the Security Council, beyond the Human Rights Office, there's an entire UN system, and they're being asked to cooperate with these findings, with the Commission, and they must be tapped. There are a lot of different offices at the UN that could be pressure points that have some relationship to North Korea, whether they're treaty bodies or the political department. There are a lot of specialized agencies, humanitarian and development organizations on the ground. Take the World Food Program. There is a need for it to take a look at the Commission of Inquiry's findings of state-sponsored discriminatory food policies. There's a need for it to look at the deliberate starvation of political prisoners. Or what about UNICEF? There's a need for it to look at children who were born in the camps or are brought to the camps with their families. How many children are there? How can one get them released? The World Health Organization has a health in prison program that is carried out around the world, not in North Korea. How can that program be applied in the case of North Korea? And what about the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which has asked for access to the border region, China, North Korea? How can that request be supported? Donor governments like the United States could encourage these agencies to identify ways to promote human rights in their work. Get behind them to do it, support the Secretary Generals tapping the entire system, given the fact that crimes against humanity have been found. outside the UN, more and more governments need to raise the priority of human rights in North Korea in their policies and their programs. And that would mean in dialogues that take place, in public diplomacy, emphasizing that relations cannot be fundamentally improved without improvement in human rights, in any consideration of development aid, in developing joint strategies with other governments and legislative bodies. This would mean human rights legislation. This would mean targeted sanctions. And it would also mean exposing North Koreans to other ideas and other experiences through people-to-people contacts, exchanges, broadcasts. Now, the main objectives would be better integrating human rights concerns in policy, gaining access to the country, getting human rights dialogues going on, getting access to the camps, getting better food policies, and developing strategies to deal bilaterally and jointly with China, which also experiences problems stemming from North Korea's failed policies. Not to speak of China's reputation, which certainly stands to be even more tarnished at this point, since it's being associated with crimes against humanity and aiding and abetting those crimes that the North Koreans are carrying out. So the objectives here would be a moratorium on deportations by China, would be an effort to get it to rein in North Korean excesses, to make it known to China and North Korea that their own officials involved in carrying out these crimes and their own security agents could be held accountable in time. So, to conclude, we have to look at the COI report as not an end in itself, the beginning of a long march toward gaining freedom for the North Korean people. It'll take a lot of different actors to maintain the momentum and to build on it that this report has now brought forward. And I believe that many people, if not everyone in this room, can find ways to contribute to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. I'll ask one question, then open it up for Q&A with the audience. To pick up on one of the points that you concluded with in terms of China's role in forcibly repatriating North Korean refugees that end up in its territory, one of the most striking statements in the Commission of Inquiry is not to be found within the report itself, but an addendum, a letter submitted by the Chinese ambassador to the UN office in Geneva, Ambassador Wu Haitao. And just to put a couple of citations from that letter, because it's striking to see the distinction of our reading of this report and his reading. To this, end quote, China does not support the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry. DPRK citizens who have entered China do it for economic reasons. Therefore, they are not refugees. Some NGOs and religious groups from the Republic of Korea, under the pretext of humanitarianism, are engaged in the organized smuggling of DPRK citizens who cross the borders illegally, which constitute crimes universally recognized by the international community. The allegation that repatriated DPRK citizens from China face torture in the DPRK is not true. Quite simply, the more opportunities that China has to make this argument publicly, the more its reputation is going to suffer, because it is so divorced from the reality that all people live in. I'm curious, as you look at China's traditional concern for reputational risk, as through the United Nations process, through opportunities that members of Congress have, through writing letters to the Chinese ambassador in Washington or elsewhere, asking if they agree with those statements, through legislation and resolutions. Do you view Beijing as the immovable object that it's traditionally been on this issue, or do you see hope for change?
I always hope for change. I've done so all my professional life. with human rights. But let me say about China, I think that this report is difficult for them. And I think it's a bit of a game changer on that as well. Because the report goes into quite at length a challenge, presents a real challenge to their usual arguments. Their business as usual is that these are economic migrants and they don't suffer anything much on being forced back into North Korea. And here you have 400 pages, and you have, of the more than 300 witnesses, 100 at least are talking about the repatriations, what happened to them, what terrible atrocities that were committed against them. And there it is, with names and witnesses and testimonies. It's very, very difficult to make this argument because anyone just looks at the report. Now, what China also says in that letter, the ambassador, they use the word stability, and I think that's your real key here. There's a great fear that if North Koreans could leave their country, there would be a tremendous flow into China, and the result would be that North Korea itself would become an unstable place. And so China is really going to have to consider whether the kind of stability that exists in North Korea right now is very sound and strong. And it seems to me that they at different times want to influence North Korea to make some changes. I believe at the border, the shoot-to-kill orders, I think I've read that the Chinese at one point even told the North Koreans they didn't want people shot on the Chinese side of the border. There must be embarrassments. They have to defend this regime. This is their ward, and as it was pointed out, at the council they defended themselves. They didn't really defend North Korea. So I think that the governments have to jointly and multilaterally begin to push on these issues, that people have to be allowed out of this country, and that those that remain in the country should not be treated in the way they're being treated, and that the kind of stability that China is supposedly reaching from the way North Korea is not going to produce stability in the long term. But in any event, I think very good arguments should be marshaled, but you need priority and policies that are going to be raising this with the Chinese so regularly that they have to begin to look at it and take some action.
Well, I think that the point that Roberta has made, that it's a matter of stability versus reputation for China, but is this stability really sound and strong? Ultimately, that even the North Korean refugee crisis is going to turn out to be a threat to the stability that China seems to be so keen on. And certainly over the long run,